looking at Romans 3, and we've already looked at chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 3 and verse 20. And so tonight we're going to look at basically verses 21 through 31. Let me pause again for a cough. All right, chapter 3, verses 21 to 31. Let me go ahead and take an opportunity to read that. It says, "But now apart from the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ, for all those who believe, for there is no distinction. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, being justified as a gift by His grace, the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in His blood through faith. This was to demonstrate His righteousness, because in the forbearance of God He passed over the sins previously committed. For the demonstration, I say, of His righteousness at the present time, so that He would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? Of works? No, but by a law of faith. Now we maintain that a man is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is He not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since indeed God will justify the circumcised by faith, and the uncircumcised through faith is one. Do we then nullify the law through faith? May it never be. On the contrary, we establish the law." Now you'll notice tonight that we're covering a smaller section because now we're entering into this section that's dealing with justification. In chapter 1, the first 15 verses, we dealt with the greeting and the introduction. Then verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1, we dealt with the theme, and the theme is the gospel, or you could even say the righteousness of God. And now, we also looked at verses 18 of chapter 1 through chapter 3 and verse 20. We looked at condemnation. We saw the unrighteous Gentiles, the unrighteous Jews, and the unrighteous humankind. And now we're considering the next section, which is justification. And it begins right here in chapter 3 and verse 21. And it takes us all the way to chapter 5 and verse 21. So it's another large section. So in this section, as we look at this whole doctrine of justification, we're looking at or learning about the provision of God's righteousness. If you think about it, in the previous section that we looked at, we saw how Paul shut all under sin, and he basically, like I said, he pointed out three groups so that no one is without excuse. No one can say, well, you didn't look at me, Paul, you didn't cover me. Because in the first section, again, he dealt with unrighteous Gentiles, and the Jew looks back and says, yeah, you're right. Just look how bad they are. But then he says, you, oh man, you're without excuse. You have the law of God, and you're doing the very same thing they're doing. And you're held to an even greater accountability because you have the law of God. And so he shut them under sin, basically closed their mouths in what they were saying. And then the last part of chapter 3, or I should say the first part of it, up through verse 20, he dealt with the rest of all mankind. So basically, he come to this conclusion, like he says in verse 23, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one. No one can say, I am without sin. Because he's just painted this graphic picture of the entire human race as fallen. And not only as fallen, but judged and condemned. And like he says in chapter 1 and verse 18, that they are under the wrath of God. And why are they under the wrath of God? Because they hold down, they suppress the truth in unrighteousness, and what may be clearly known about God, they certainly reject it. They don't want God in their thoughts. They don't want anything to do with God. You know, a lot of people may say that, in their sin, they really wish that God was dead, but there's really those that go further than that, and they say, no, I don't really wish God was dead. I wish God didn't exist at all. Because they want to remove all kind of restraint, and they want to remove all kinds of accountability. But as you and I know, there are restraints all over our life, aren't there? We have restraints in our families where we can't just do anything that we want to do without affecting people in our family. We have restraints in society. That's why we have laws. You just can't do whatever you want to do. You just can't carry out whatever the dictates are of your own darkened heart, because there are restraints. And the ultimate restraint, of course, is God. And we saw in chapter 1, with dealing with unrighteous Gentiles, that if a person is just totally rejecting God and totally going after their sin, He will give them over to it. The sin will be their own destruction. And we saw how that phrase, God gave them over, was used 3 times there. So if you look at this now, one of the things that you see, as we have pointed out in chapter 1, 2 times He talked about the gospel of God, but He never got into it, did He? No, He stopped and said, let me first talk about the bad news. And that's, again, where He dealt with condemnation. Now when you get into this next section, we're talking about the good news. See, what's so wonderful about that is that you really cannot appreciate the good news of what God has done and what He declares based upon Christ and His death on the cross, His satisfaction for our sin, His appeasement to God. None of us could completely understand that or appreciate that without first knowing that we're condemned. And that's what He's doing now. He's now going to talk about this whole idea of justification. Man is under sin. Man is without excuse. What can he do? Well, again, this is where the gospel comes in. And if you look at verse 21, I like this. It says, but now. And then he gets into the good news. And this is good news. So he gives us a solution to man's dilemma. And so basically, as we look at this first part of it, because this is actually broken down in several parts, this whole understanding of justification, the first part takes place in verses 21 to 31, where Paul begins to show us the source of righteousness. Just where does this righteousness come from? What is this righteousness that is applied to the sinner? How is it applied to him? How is it possible that God could declare a sinner righteous when he's not? And that's what he deals with in this section. Look at verse 21. Notice there the phrase, the righteousness of God. Now, the righteousness that God requires sinners, they can't provide, can they? The only righteousness that man possesses or attains within himself is unrighteousness. And because that is the character and the substance of his fallen nature. Man's righteous deeds, as Isaiah 64:6 says, are like filthy garments. And excuse me if this offends you, but the word that he uses there is for a menstrual garment. He's saying here that that is what man's righteousness equates to. Well, the light of righteousness comes only from above. So the righteousness that God requires is that which He alone gives. He provides what He requires. And that's good, because if He doesn't, we're in a heap of trouble. So in verse 22, it tells us that this righteousness comes through faith in Jesus Christ. Now, before we go any further into this section, let me go ahead and define some terms. It's really important that we understand what justification means, because as Luther insisted, justification by faith alone is the article upon which the church stands or falls. And if the church does not get this right, as he says, the church ceases to be an authentic church. And if the church denies or obscures the doctrine of justification by faith alone, it is no longer a Christian body. So let's deal first of all with the meaning of justification. And in order to do that, we need to make it clear from the very beginning, justification is not an act of divine pardon. It's not an act of divine pardon. In justification, God does not pardon the sinner. See, when a criminal is pardoned, he's forgiven of his crime and set free. And certainly justification does involve forgiveness, but we don't need to confuse it with the act of divine, or confuse the act of divine justification with an act of pardon. See, what